I'm really excited to be going on a bit of a journey with you into Australian history and into a particularly interesting part of Australian history which in my mind blends a little bit with the Rhodes Must Fall, British imperialism, British legacy debates, but it also connects up to a very, very dark part of history in my own mind and something I'm grappling with, and that's Holocaust history. We're going to be looking at the history of the Australian Frontier Wars, an area that most Australians were largely unaware was a period of Australian history until recently. When I was at school, no one ever mentioned this, and that's part of the issue here. So we're going to, in this flipped video, explore some of the starting points of what we should be thinking about as we approach study of this Australian Frontier Wars concept. The Frontier Wars operate or took place from the time the First Fleet arrived in 1788 through to the 1930s, as late as that. Some people might actually argue it goes later, but that's probably not a bad end date. And I'd like you to take a moment to have a look at the cartoon I've put here. It's suggesting that we remember some of the wars that have shaped Australian history and perhaps not others. Our own conflicts as Australia developed, as Australia became a European dominant nation, conflicts that perhaps have been forgotten, and they're an area that we need to explore. So let's do that now. This colonial period of history that we're about to study touches a real nerve in our national psyche. That nerve touching, that uncomfortableness with our past is connected to our own sense of who we are as a nation and in our national debates around concepts such as Australia Day. The most heated of the national debates are often led not by historians but by politicians and media figures who are playing and using language to appeal to particular interest groups. They play upon certain perspectives, certain prejudices, certain understandings that exist within the public at large, and I might sort of say perhaps even misunderstandings out there in the community. So as we look at that idea I had there of a cartoon in which we should perhaps have memorials to different types of wars, what I'm throwing up now is this kind of logo for our unit, which is as we look at these issues, as we look at our past, as we look at our understanding of warfare in Australian history, maybe there's a whole stack of questions we need to raise in our minds, and how we do that matters. As we approach this debate, let's be aware that some of the loudest voices, the voices that seem to speak with the most certainty in this debate, may or may not have much grounding or interest in the historical background and the historical evidence that's emerging. The historical evidence, and remember we're in a subject called history, the historical evidence that we are dealing with is stuff that's sort of been raised by, I guess, historians in the Australian landscape since about 1988, since the bicentenary of the arrival of the First Fleet. And there's been this ongoing conversation about how those events and how European settlement, invasion, what words do we use, how that colonisation period should be viewed in Australian history. It's the same argument that comes up in Africa. It's a public discourse that's sometimes vitriolic, it's bitter, it's aggressive, and it's divisive. It's sometimes very heated, sometimes very contested space with very loud and aggressively put opinions, and it's a space in which history and politics have become enmeshed. It's sometimes historians are suggested that they are taking a left point of view or a right point of view in politics, that they are siding with certain groups of politics. And we need to unpick that a little bit. The debates often centre around the nature of the historical relationship between Indigenous Australians, the Aboriginals, the Aboriginal people of Australia, the first people of Australia, the language we choose again matters, and usually European colonists. However, there were people who arrived during the colonial period of Australian history from areas such as China who worked in our gold fields, and there was conflict there as well. The understandings of this era that we're studying in this unit are really closely connected to the practices of British imperialism. So the ideas you've developed in our previous unit apply here. It's also very connected to our sense of memory of who we are, and sometimes that's a constructed memory and nostalgia, perhaps the way we like to remember our own upbringing, that we portray our own personal history, our family history in a certain light. Maybe the way in which we engage with this period of Australian history is connected to a sense of nostalgia, perhaps a sense of guilt concerning the past, and even in some cases legal concerns over land ownership and the way in which different people have come in possession of certain lands.